In this video we will be talking about the Sony A7 IV. 8 weeks of use from a Fujifilm shooter's perspective. There are definitely a couple of things I liked, which I disliked, but we will dive into them into this video. First topic on the list would be definitely the ergonomics compared to the Fujifilm system. There's quite a bit of difference going when you think about the Fujifilm system with their old school layout and the buttons on top of a camera, and you got the ISO, shutter speed and aperture dial. Now coming down to the Sony system, it's quite a bit stripped down and differently in layout. So it definitely took a bit time to get used to it, not having a dedicated ISO dial on top of the camera. But at the end, you still got the ISO button at the back of a camera as well. So the swap or the switch from a Fujifilm system down to the Sony system wasn't as hard as I expected. A lot of button and dial layout on a Sony A7 IV straight out of the box make quite a lot of sense in my personal opinion. One thing I was shocked about at the beginning when I jumped over to the Sony A7 IV was the battery life. The battery drained the camera and there was no tomorrow anymore. And I didn't understood why the battery or why the camera sucks the battery empty within less than 24 hours. But after updating the firmware twice to the newest firmware for the Sony A7 IV, this problem was solved and the battery life is good. It's rated to 670 shots, so you easily can shoot all day long with one battery in your Sony. However, I still find that the Sony is a bit more battery hungry than my Fujifilm X-T4, but if you think about it, there will be several different points why the Sony will be more battery hungry. Think about the bigger sensor, think about the IBIS. A bigger sensor and IBIS automatically will need more power than an APS-C sensor with the IBIS. So overall the battery after updating a firmware was fantastic. The biggest difference I found is S-Log versus F-Log. First of all, the S-Log from a Fujifilm. The S-Log from a Sony A7 IV is completely different structured in a process how you need to work with it. So you need to overexpose your S-Log up to 1.7 stops or 1.3, 1.7 stops to get a full dynamic range out of the S-Log. And then you bring everything else back in post, you dial down your exposure and get the best good looking S-Log footage or recovered footage as possible. With the Fujifilm, you did try to expose your F-Log correctly, then you graded it. So coming from the F-Log down to the S-Log, that was probably the biggest learning point. You purposely overexpose what you usually don't do with your pictures or with your F-Log. So I think this was the biggest learning curve, to overexpose purposely your S-Log to get the most dynamic range out of it, and then you jump into your program and then you dial everything back down to the perfect exposure. I think that was the biggest learning point when it comes down to the Sony A7 IV. However, coming down to the process and the speed of a process and how Sony is integrated into programs such as like DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Pro, the Sony definitely got a bit of an advantage when it comes down to the filming side. Fuji definitely got the higher specs and the better specs and more flexibility when it comes down to customization or your frame rates. But I found that the Sony is definitely easier to handle and is more integrated into systems and programs. I found the Sony definitely got a little advantage in this case. One thing when it comes down to the Sony, and I like to believe that's also down to the Sony A7 III, A7 R5, or perhaps the FX3 or even FX6, correct me if I'm wrong in this case. When it comes down to your frame rates, the Fujifilm system got 100% flexibility. You can choose and pick your frame rates, how you would like to have them, what you want to shoot. You want to shoot today 24 frames per second, you choose your 24 frames today. If you want to shoot, let's say, 30 frames per second, 50 frames per second, 60 frames per second tomorrow, you choose 24, 25, 30, 50, 60 frames per second. It does not matter what sort of frame rate you would like to choose. You can pick and choose with the Fujifilm system and you just go off and shoot. With the Sony, it's slightly different, and I was actually a bit surprised about this because I haven't seen many people talking about this. When it comes down to your frame rates, you either need to shoot PAL or NTSC. If I'm right now, I'm gonna link it down here. And you need to choose basically based off your area you're living, your frame rates. You either shoot 24 and 60 frames per second, or you shoot 25 and 50 frames per second, which was a bit of a surprise, to be honest, for myself, because I think if I pay 2.5 grand for a camera body, I should be able to pick and choose the frame rates how I would like to have them. I choose my configuration. If I want to shoot 24 frames per second by a bitrate, let's say of 400, then I should be able to pick and choose how I would like to have my setup. However, I think this also has to do with that Sony cameras approved are for Netflix, and having those limitations in certain ways where you need to pick and choose PAL or NTSC to say you are in this area, you need to shoot PAL with 24 frames per second at 25 frames per second and 50 frames per second, or you need to choose NTSC where you shoot 24 or 60 frames per second. I think it was a bit of a surprise. It's not a big deal breaker that Sony tells you what sort of configuration you should shoot, and it probably makes life a bit easier if someone starts off with a Sony system to say you shoot 24 frames per second by a bitrate of 100 megabytes. Definitely the easier point with the Sony. Having 100% flexibility with a Fujifilm system where you can say you shoot 24 frames per second, 400 megabytes, it's a bit of a learning curve. It's not the downside, it's not the good side. It was just a bit of a surprise because if you watch a lot of Sony videos or reviews, no one really talks about it, that you actually need to pick and choose. At least I haven't seen it, so it was a bit of a surprise. However, I found with the Sony system, getting told what you need to use, such as like 24 frames per second by a color space of 4 to 0 by 100 megabytes, it's definitely a bit easier than with the Fujifilm, and you definitely get enough data and information out of this clip because the Sony camera is already pre-programmed to shoot this sort of combination. Obviously, the most biggest change coming from a Fujifilm system is actually having a full frame sensor now, which shoots 33 megapixel. Having 26 megapixel or 33 megapixel is a really huge difference. If you put the pictures side by side, then you probably won't see a huge difference. However, the benefit of having full frame with 33 megapixel is you can crop further in than with the APS-C sensor. So having the capability of, or the latitude, the flexibility of cropping into your image slightly further than with the APS-C sensor can be very handy sometimes and beneficial when, let's say, you use a lens and you don't have a reach but you want to crop a bit closer in your subject, in your image. Then having the extra megapixel is definitely handy and was beneficial in certain moments for myself already. Fujifilm definitely had a great customization of their cameras. You could pretty much set any single button to any sort of function you wanted to do, and having a lot of flexibility with the Fujifilm system when it comes down to customization was great. However, I think that Sony definitely got a great customization as well when it comes down to the Sony A7 IV. You got a bunch of different buttons you can program for different functions you want to use. You can change the ISO dial down to the top dial if you wanted to. So having a good flexibility when it comes down to customization is fantastic. You can get the camera to the setup you would like to have it and make this camera basically your own. And here are my overall thoughts coming from a Fujifilm system, or partly from a Fujifilm system, down to the Sony A7 IV. What do I think? Did it improve my photography necessarily? Not really, not 100%, because I got great images out of a Fujifilm system. But coming down to a full frame sensor, having a bit more latitude when it comes down to ISO, or shooting a lower ISO than with the APS-C camera, can be handy in certain moments when you shoot a lot of low light stuff, as an example. I think what blow my mind the most was actually the autofocus from a Sony system. Right now, if you come from an older Fujifilm camera, such as like the X-T3 or even X-T4, the X-T4 had a fantastic autofocus system already. It wasn't perfect, no camera is perfect, but it had its weak points every now and then. And with the Sony system, which the autofocus is more or less perfect. Of course, there will be also situation when the Sony will be lacking for whatever reason, but having an autofocus system where you don't really need to worry at all about it was a fantastic experience, and it gave you even more confidence in certain moments to make sure that your image is sharp or your eyes are in portrait sharp. So overall, I think it was a fantastic experience with the Alpha or Sony A7 IV. Enjoyed it hugely. Right now for filming my videos, having the S-Log with the flexibility of grading, which is more integrated into certain programs. It's definitely a fantastic benefit to have, because it makes life a bit easier when your S-Log or the Sony is more integrated in programs. It will speed up the progress or process of my editing. I can get videos quicker out, as I mentioned in one of my recent videos. So overall, I think it was fantastic that I bought the Sony A7 IV. Hugely enjoyed it, and yeah, overall, I think there are definitely benefits of both camera brands and disadvantages, but those are a few points where I picked up on, and perhaps in a couple of months I'm gonna do another review or another talking point about the Sony A7 IV, let you know how I got on with it. And with that said, my friend, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the Fuji system compared to the Sony system. And I'm, yeah, happy to use both of them nowadays and have this, yeah, camera and use both of them. And that's the end of this video. I hope you liked it, my friend. And if you do, hit the thumbs up button, like, comment, subscribe, do all the good stuff. And don't forget to let me know your thoughts about the Sony A7 IV. And with that said, I'm gonna see you, my friend, very soon in another video. Cheers, mate. I wanted to see what the hype is all about shooting Sony. Sushi. Sushi.